Hey everyone, you're listening to the Active Turnkey podcast, a podcast designed for hands-off, passive real estate rental investors. In the Active Turnkey podcast, you'll hear Tom Olson and Jared Stoutmeister discuss all things turnkey rentals with other turnkey providers, service providers, and rental investors. Our goal is to help you reach your financial freedom and whatever comes after that. Let's go. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Active Turnkey podcast. I'm your host Jared Stoutmeister, and I have with us Tom Olson again today. And we are back with another podcast. Last week we had hosted a few guys come in our office, our guests, and so this week we're having kind of our normal podcast setting and back in our studio. And so the lighting is just perfect. And
perfect lighting.
Yeah, it is. My makeup's right. My makeup's good. So I'm ready to do this.
I need a haircut, but other than that, we're good.
Yeah, you do need a haircut. So we have another podcast today. We're gonna try to make this good on time.
We're gonna try to make this one good.
Yeah, we're gonna try to make it good and timely.
I thought last week was good, and I do want to kind of remind people, if you didn't listen to last week's podcast, kind of the whole purpose of last week's podcast was it doesn't matter where you're investing. At least make the trip out. At least kind of go out and see the people that you're working with, see the neighborhoods that you might be investing in, get it comfortable with everything that you need to be comfortable with. And we had a really great meeting with those guys last week. When we have meetings almost every week with people that come. So if you guys are interested in coming to see our operation, or maybe you're a property management company and you want to figure out how to do more of what we're doing, I'm totally open to kind of letting you guys come in and see what we're doing, and try to be able to help in any way, for as far as that is concerned as well. Find those people that if you're looking to invest in, and I think right now is a great time to invest. I think there's some people that are thinking, well, maybe we're at the top of the market, or maybe things are changing, and I couldn't agree with you more, but I also think you have to really pay attention, and that's kind of what today's podcast is all about. Pay attention to what's really going on. Some people during this time, they might be thinking, well, let's sell the property. But I think there's another option than just to sell the property. When the house goes vacant, you have a new chance to be able to kind of reassess the market. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. And not just the market when it comes to retail prices of the home, but also rent prices.
Sure. And that really matters as far as how long you've owned the property. I mean, if you've owned it for just a year and you're thinking of flipping it, you may not make your money back necessarily.
You might make your money, and that's fine. But it's like, did you really get into it for that? And most people, I would say no.
Sure.
But I mean, it was interesting. Just last week, I was just kind of browsing different rentals in this area just to kind of see what was going on. And I didn't find any of ours because they were all rented. And I found a lot of other rental management companies that weren't rented. So I'm not quite sure why they can't rent theirs and we rent ours. But anyways, that's a whole different story for a different day for a different topic. But what it was interesting is I was seeing, and I'm looking through different prices and looking at different areas. And it's almost like in our area, literally the rents have gone up like $200, maybe $300, even $400 a month. I was seeing 3.2s in Maryville, which I'm used to charging $1,350, $1,400, and I'm seeing them for $1,800.
Right.
So Jared's like, well, what should we do a podcast? I'm like, why don't we talk about rent increases or rent decreases? So I did some studying, and kind of like, it was interesting because I've been saying a lot of what we're seeing happen now, but I've been saying it in more general terms. And now we're kind of starting to see very specifically those markets that are being hurt because of COVID, and how there's probably just as many markets around the country where rents are going down than there are markets around the country that rents are going up.
Right.
And we just happen to live in one of those areas where it's obvious to me, and it wasn't us. We didn't push the rents up. We're looking at what other people are charging, and we're just like, wow, maybe we're not charging enough when we have turnover, and we're trying to reevaluate that for our own market. So I figured, hey, if we're doing this, maybe we should get on the podcast, tell other people, hey, you need to be paying attention to your market as well and know what's going on, what people are willing to pay. When it comes to house sales or rent, real estate always, everything about real estate goes by one rule. Unless the government wants to step in and do something silly, or do something stupid like rent caps or whatever that they do. If it's just a free market, really it's all about one rule: supply and demand. How much demand is there and how much supply is there? That is what's going to completely dictate what somebody can pay. I mean, the secondary thing, it's not the first thing. I think everybody talks about affordable housing and everybody thinks it's all about affordability. It's really not. It's really about supply and demand. I mean, do you think housing and do you think, condos are affordable in San Francisco? No, but the prices kept going up. Now they're starting to go down now. But like the prices kept going up, not because they were affordable. They went up because supply and demand. People wanted to live there. It's just really interesting right now. So I'm excited about today's podcast.
Yeah, so Tom kind of alluded to what we're doing today. He's excited about it, and I am too. I am really excited about it.
He's pumped.
But today's podcast is about when to raise rent. When to raise rent. Now, there's situations. So Tom talked about it. One of them is you have a vacant property. It's time to assess that situation. Or we can also discuss today, if you have a property that's available. So you have a lease that's ending and you have 2 or 3 months before your lease is going to end. That's a good time at that point to determine whether or not you want to raise rent. So that's something you want to have a conversation, first of all, with your property manager. And if they don't reach out to you, you should be reaching out to them, asking them, hey, 2-3 months ahead of time, I want to reach out to the tenant, offer this rental increase if there's going to be one in place. And then now the standard from when I've just here around the country, the standard rental increase 2 to 3%, sometimes up to 5% per year annually. And so it seems like most are 2 to 3%, but some people are even up to 5. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about that, what situations that we should be looking at and how to go about raising your rent. Obviously, it's a little more easier when you have a vacant home. So, Tom, first step, it seems to be kind of like what you were talking about before, is to see what your market's doing, like what's happening in that area for rent.
I would say absolutely. You definitely want to know what else is out there, and you have to kind of compare. It's kind of like when you're trying to sell a property. It's the same thing. You have to compare yours to what else is out there. I mean, if yours is the trashiest house out of all of them, you're probably not going to get what everybody else is getting. But on the flip side, if yours is nicer than everybody's, well, then maybe you can get a little bit more than what everybody else can get. Mr. Landlord, is one of my mentors, and I've gone to a lot of his things over the years. And really, he says, the first thing you need to do is determine what the rent's going to be. And how do you determine that? He says, how much do you want? He says, don't even go to the market. He says, don't even look at the market. I mean, to me, I feel like it's hard not to at least look and see what else is going on out there, how other people might be getting. And again, when I saw a 3.2, 1,400 square foot house in Maryville renting for $1,800, and I don't see it now. I actually checked this morning to see if it was still there, and it's not there anymore, which means it rented. I think to myself, okay, the market is now telling me that if we just don't have a vacancy, so it's not like we can just, all of a sudden just create one out of thin air, unless we get a house and do our thing with it, which we might. But I think when it comes to a house going vacant that you own in your portfolio, I do think it bodes to the question, okay, well, maybe now I can sell the property. The market's hot. Houses are selling very quickly when I go to sell. And maybe that is the option. Maybe some people want to take that as the option. But I think there is another valid option here. If you were getting $1,400 for your rent and now you could get $1,800 a month, would you rather have the $400 more a month plus whatever you were making? Or would you rather have, maybe a little bit of extra, cash in your pocket that you're going to have to pay capital gains tax on? Or if you're going to have 1031 and pay for a 1031, however you're going to do that. But so I definitely think it's something to consider and something to pay attention to. Again, what's really interesting is when I dug into this, I didn't know this was going to be the case. I predicted it was going to be the case, but I didn't realize it was going to happen so fast. You're seeing markets like San Jose, literally go down 15% in the last year. You're seeing places like New York City go down, the actual average rent is going down in those locations. So you talked about the average increase. Well, when we have a pandemic, when you have certain things going on, there are other external factors that will kind of make or break markets. And I think right now is one of those times, and I've been saying this, there's going to be a price to pay, and we're already starting to see that price. And that price is, well, now property values are going to be worth less, rents are going to be less, the supply and demand has been disrupted, and where do those people have to go somewhere. So where are those people moving from and where are those people moving to? That is the only factor when it comes to supply and demand, is like how many people are moving to those areas. Just because a house is cheaper doesn't necessarily mean there's more demand for it, and just because it's more expensive doesn't necessarily mean there's more demand for it. But so pay attention to what's going on. Make sure that wherever you're going, you're making that a part of the your thought process and thinking through all of that, and kind of just pay attention. Really, at the end of the day, I think that's one of the things that I think people don't do enough. They pay attention to things that don't really matter, like the media and all the negative news and all the idiots that are in Congress, and the waste of money that we for some reason our congressmen and congress ladies love to do by having ridiculous witch hunts for things. And we can talk about that all day long, but so we spend so much of our time focused on that stuff instead of focusing on what really matters and how we can actually either make more money or how we can have a better impact on our community. So and honestly, and there's kind of two sides of this. You got to be careful as well. I think when you have a renter in there, I think part of the determining factor of do I raise this rent or not. We kind of put a freeze on most of our rent raises during COVID, but let me tell you this, there's a big but in there. Is this a tenant I want to keep, or is this a tenant I don't want to keep?
Well, Tom's getting ahead of us here.
Sorry.
So I want to. Well,
you kind of asked both, so
I did. No, but I want to slow it down because I do have a question there. So with what we're seeing across the market, that's a great point. So we even talked about just looking up and seeing what's happening. Some areas where rents increased dramatically in our market, and it's like that in Gary and other places too. But if I'm an investor, and we just talked about it, so if I own a property in San Jose, if you go by the standard, which is 2 to 3% or 5%, now I'm raising my rents without paying attention to what's happening in the market.
You got it. You're going to be sitting there, and
you're going to have vacancy and all that effort because you wanted to raise rent, needless or not counting the fact that the market went down. And then the same thing goes here. We talked about it before the podcast. There's a lot of guys who have been in our market forever, and they've been renting for $650, $700, and they think they're killing it because they raise it $100, and they're at $800 or $850. And if it's a nice house in Gary, $850 is not enough. Not for a 3-bed. No,
right now
it's just not. So again, a lot of times the assumption and going by the 2 to 3% rule, not going into your market could be a factor. Is that accurate?
But I think it goes back to what you just said, not for a nice house. So
right, correct.
The problem is you do have areas, you do have low-end areas where you have low-end landlords. And that's probably a whole nother conversation. And I think our standard for what we try to put in our properties, and I think the standard which I would do, and it doesn't matter what market I go to, there is no glory in being the cheapest person in a market. There's just it's horrible. It's a horrible business model. To me, I would much rather be the most expensive than be the cheapest in any market. I don't. It doesn't matter what it is to me. If your property is on the nicer end, or if it's one of the nicer type of properties in your market, I think those are the ones. Yeah. It's a lot of it has to go back to the property. People used to say, real estate has 3 rules: location, location, location. I'm not really even 100% sure I 100% believe that anymore. I believe it to a certain degree. Sure. Don't get me wrong. I understand schools matter, although it doesn't really seem like they matter now with COVID. I understand that, to a certain degree, area matters. Absolutely. You want to stay out of a war zone. But at the end of the day, somebody still has to live there. And if they can't afford the $2,000 a month, they got to go find somewhere else where they can't afford and where jobs are. So if the jobs are there, if everything else is somewhat normal in a market, I actually believe the actual property itself is starting to become just as much as an important factor in that equation, especially when it comes to rents. Maybe more so when it comes to renting than it does when it comes to buying a property. But if I'm gonna buy a property to live in, yes, probably location. Like me and my wife right now are looking at a second home, potentially in Florida, and we're I would love to be by water. I would love to, so location matters to me. But if I was going to go rent a place and I'm just kind of a renter, or maybe I'm only going to be living in a place for a temporary, housing, that's not really that big of a deal. Not as big of a deal to me as what's my comfort at home? Does this place feel like like home to me? Does it feel like, am I proud to actually sit in this home and in this place? So I again, like, I'm not saying that location does not matter.
Of course.
Absolutely, it does matter. I mean, we're even saying that now location does matter when it comes to different cities around the country that have had stricter lockdowns, that have had, ridiculous, crazy governors and mayors. Yeah. I mean, it was funny, like the Realtor Association for Florida, like, was thanking the governor of New York City for being their Realtor of the Year.
Yeah,
and in Texas, they were thanking the governor of California for being their Realtor of the Year. So, it's really interesting. I mean, there is such a price to pay. There's going to, and this is not going to stop. Like, this is going to continue. This is something that you have to pay attention to. And if it's me, for me, like, I am looking at all other markets, even for our own properties and our own turnkey operation here. And if I'm looking at other markets, I'm looking at, hey, where are people moving to? Not necessarily, I'm definitely not looking at places where people are moving away from. And they're moving away from New York. They're moving away from the Northeast, and they're moving away from California. They're moving away from Illinois at the largest rates of anywhere. And if you go through this list that I kind of went through, I think 80-90% of the markets where the rents have decreased, the top 25 have decreased, they're in one of those three states, or one of those three major areas. Yes, there's some pockets here and there that have had other issues potentially, so in that regard, I think location is very important. But when it comes to, like, people have to have a place to live, and there's just demand, and we're not building enough new properties. We're just not. It's changing the whole, like, makeup of the rental market.
I like to think that when you're choosing that property, and then what you do to it, you get what you pay for. You get the kind of tenant that you put into the property. So if you make it a property where someone wants to live there, and that's the key word, they want to live there. If they want to live there, you have yourself a good situation. You're going to find tenants quickly. It's going to be a good situation for you. But you get what you pay for when it comes to placing tenants. If you're afraid of getting a low-class tenant that don't pay their rent and they have issues with whatever, well, you have a factor in that. You have a decision in doing that.
And even when you're turning over, so if you turn over a property, and I think it always should be, like, when you're talking about rent increase, well, like, for instance, we just took over management of, like, a 20-unit building, and none of these units have been updated in, like, 20, 30 years. I mean, they're really just, to me, like, they're not to our standard. And we told the investor, like, we will not manage this unless, as tenants turn over, you're going to allow us to get these units to our standard. This investor's going to have to, spend some money. But the thing is like, when he does that for each unit, like, right now we have one vacancy in this particular building, and we're gonna probably be able to raise the rent 40% of what it was. But we're gonna have to put some money into that place. We're gonna probably put granite countertops or we're gonna put nicer new finishes in there. Probably put luxury vinyl plank flooring in, things that will last longer. That for the owner, I think, is actually going to be less maintenance for the long haul. Yeah. It's just a little bit more up front to be able to get a much higher quality tenant and be able to have a choice of that tenant. And be able to raise the rent significantly more than it was when he bought the property.
Yeah, I think that's all excellent stuff, and hopefully you guys are getting value already. We're going to start getting into a few things you want to pay attention to. So, Tom, one of the first things that you kind of think about, of course, is know your market, but are there restrictions that can come from that? Are there specific areas? You mentioned caps. Can you go into more detail about what you're talking about?
Yeah, there are small amounts of places around the country where there are rent caps. Obviously, as a turnkey operator, I would try to avoid those. Sure. As an investor, I try to avoid those as well. We can't say what's going to be in the future. We have no idea, if more restrictions may come down. I mean, obviously, with COVID going on right now, we still have, rent referendums, and we still have ways for tenants to be able to get out of paying rent for a period of time. And, we're still struggling through that with some of our properties. I think our percentages have been a lot better than the average. But there are still some, and I don't know how long that's going to last. I think we're probably at some point want to get our attorney on again. We already did a podcast with our attorney last year about those specific things. But right now we're just I think right now it's been extended to March. But most people are predicting at least September, October, and we are also already tied a podcast about maybe changing your rents, your new leases to month to month. So, I guess. What was the original question that you asked?
Well, just how that's affecting these areas about knowing more or less your local laws.
Oh yeah, I mean, obviously, you either need to have a property manager that knows them, or you do need to know, like, if there are rent caps, or if there are things that landlords can't do when it comes to raising rents. But most of that has to do when somebody's already in the property. And like I said, for us, like even during COVID, we have kind of either had very minimal increases, or we haven't had much increases for the tenants that we like that are paying on time, because it's like at this point I'd rather keep them in the property than to have to. Now on the flip side, if it's a property that we know rents have gone up $400, and that person is not really like Johnny on the spot with rent every month and is not performing the way they should, we may raise the rent on that person, and if they decide not to want to stay, then that gives us the opportunity to. But honestly, like I never feel like that's like, unless you're going to sell the property, I really never want to have that mindset. Like I just don't. Like I normally do not have that mindset at all, that I want to just kick a tenant out just to get somebody else in. I think that's kind of foolish, because you do have to spend money, and it does take, if you spend a couple $1,000s, that's like all the money you're going to make for maybe the next year. Right. So like you have to understand, like if it's $400, well, that might be worth it. Really, I mean, $400 is, you're going to make that up. You're going to make $2,000 up in 5 months. So by the end of the year, like you're going to be back to really cash flowing really, really well. And if you're going to go from cash flowing $300 to $700, I mean that's a complete game changer with your portfolio.
So let's transition to that. So the third step you're doing, so you need to know your market, what's happening. You should know your local laws. This third section is know your current situation with what you have. So if it's not vacant, if you have a tenant in place, and a couple months ahead of time you've met with your property manager, you discussed the options. One option is, yes, you are the owner and you have the right to raise the rent if your local laws allow you to. And so there's been some investors who have chosen to do that, and they've gone the 2 to 3% rate, which is your right to do that. And so we wouldn't be sitting here saying otherwise. However, there are some ways.
Right, as much as it's like it's the market. If the market says that you should do that you're just raising the rent to market rate, rates.
So along that line, what we're telling you about what we haven't been doing, we haven't been recommending those things, but we've been having some reasons for it. So one of the first things you need to analyze is, do you have a good tenant? Period. Are they a good tenant? So I've had a tenant in my first rental I ever bought. It's in, I would say, a D area. And I've had one tenant the whole time for 4 years. The guy pays on the first every month. He's never been late, not one time. And I've been thinking about raising my rent, but every time I'm thinking, if in that kind of area, I would need to put a bunch of money into the property. I've never raised the rent one time. He pays on time. I feel like I'm making money by not having vacancy.
Yeah, we have a tenant right now who's been in his location for 20 years.
Yeah,
and we did actually raise his rent a couple years ago, but it's like, am I ever going to raise his rent again? I don't know. Like, who knows? Like, he's probably already paid for the building, but I mean, it's crazy. I mean, 20 years he's been in the same place. It is, to me, like, I feel like, kind of rewarding those tenants for staying with you, and, being low maintenance tenants can definitely be, a factor. I think it has to come into the equation. I think you also have to kind of look at what else you got going on. Like if you're managing your own properties and you've got like 3 other vacancies, well, maybe you don't. Maybe you want to,
absolutely.
And like I don't think that's normal. For us. But I mean, I know we're talking to people that have rentals in completely different markets, and you guys, and every market's a little different. So when it comes to our area, I know what we say to do for us, but when it comes to another area, you might be in one of those areas that's either a flat rental market, or a market that's gone way up, or a market that's gone way down, and people are just flooding the streets, so are leaving as fast as they can, like New York City. But anyway, so that's kind of, I think, knowing all that, paying attention to all of that, and then determining where you're at, I think is a good kind of couple steps to.
So yeah, I mean, you mentioned it. Are they a good tenant? Do they take care of their property? And that goes a lot into, do they want to live there? That's key. If they want to live there, generally they will take better care of the property, and they appreciate where they live, and they like where they live. Another thing is, do they pay every month? Now, I didn't say do they pay on time every month, but do they pay every month? Life happens, and in many cases they're renting for a reason. But if they pay on the 6th every month and not on the 1st, are you okay with that? if they pay a late fee I went to an appraisal yesterday that the tenant said right then, the guy asked, how much is your rent? She said $950. She's like, actually it's $1,000 because I pay late every month. She was like, it was a fact, but she pays every month. And are you okay with having a tenant who pays their rent every month? And again, if you have just a month or two of vacancy, that's just eliminated any kind of rent increase you've instituted. And then on top of that, I think right now we have to think about rocking the boat with the tenant during COVID. Although there are legitimate reasons why you would want to increase rent, why you should be able to increase rate. There's also situations where if you have a tenant who's a good tenant, they take care of your property, they pay every month, but now you're going to raise rent, especially a significant rent increase, unless you have a plan for it, like you said, that could rock the boat with a really good tenant, and they may not appreciate that. So it's just something to think about in that sense.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think all these things kind of go along with the same thing. I mean, I feel like all tenants are in one of three categories. They're an A tenant, low maintenance, they pay on time, they take care of their property, right? Like they're a B where like maybe at some point some training, maybe some coaxing, maybe they'll at some point maybe be an A tenant. And then you have your C tenants, and that like they're never going to be an A. They're a pain in the butt. Every time they call, it's complaining and whining instead of like. I mean, honestly, if there's issues, like a property management company knows that they're going to have to take care of an issue.
Right.
It's the attitude behind it, and it's like all of the other stuff that kind of all the drama that kind of goes along with it. And for us, like I mean, I'm always looking at. Okay, I want to keep my A's. I'm trying to make my B's into A's, and then my C's I'm always trying to replace. Yeah. And if you think about that, like throughout your portfolio, I think I would caution with it. I would say yes, this is true, but with caution. I think sometimes I've seen on the flip side where somebody's had a portfolio for say 1, 2, 3 years, and then they go to a coach or they go to a mentor, and the coach or mentor's like, well, take all of your properties and see which ones are performing well and which ones are performing bad, and then just get rid of all the ones that are performing bad. And I'm just like, unless you know the specifics about each one of those particular properties, and it's like it's kind of like it sounds so great and so wise for this coach or mentor to say that, but then you find out like if those people would have held on to those properties like in a time like to now, and now they would have possibly been thinking about selling, they probably would have made like 50, 60, 80 grand instead of, I mean, literally we had a couple people sell properties like 2 or 3 years ago, and I'm thinking, like I told them this was the wrong time to sell. They shouldn't have done it. Did it anyways. And honestly now we actually I think just resold one of those properties ourselves because we end up buying one of these properties back. And I'm like, I'll buy that property all day long. And we're gonna sell this thing for like 70 grand more than what this guy was willing to let it go for. So so just be careful with that. But absolutely, like I do think about A's, B's, and C's. When it comes to the tenant itself, I think the property is a little different animal, because sometimes the tenant really determines the property. You know what I mean? Like, and how much money you actually make. A lot of it's in the hands of that tenant, and how and if they're actually good tenants or not. So, I think all those things combined is a good thing to good things to think about. And I think I think the best thing out of this podcast that I would tell you to just do is go back and look at your markets. Look at where look at where you have houses that you are renting, and look at what other houses are being marketed for, and just see, just do a little check, maybe do some research on your own, and when properties become vacant, or when it comes time for turnover, make sure that you are on top of making those decisions.
So again, in the end, the most important thing is keeping your house occupied. Make sure you have cash flow coming in, and these are some things that
we used to say occupied. Now it's like we're making sure the rent is collected.
Yeah, that's true.
So like, it's really interesting because our occupancy rate is much higher now than actually collections rate, which is not normal. Normally, like you want them to be very similar.
That's a good point.
But with COVID, it's a little bit of a different animal, and let's just hope and pray that this doesn't last forever, and hopefully that we get back to some kind of normal. I'm not sure it's ever going to be back to be what it was pre-COVID, but hopefully we'll have some kind of normality in the next couple months.
No, Tom corrected me correctly. It's definitely not occupied. It is current is the key word. And so hopefully a few of these things, that naturally there's a whole lot more moving parts that happen there. But these are some things you just need to think about. If you have a good tenant, how valuable is that to you? Or if you have a poor tenant, and we did have a tenant who we had some sub-temperature weather here, around 10 degrees or so, and they were upset because they couldn't keep the house above 75 degrees. So that's an unrealistic tenant.
C tenant. C.
Yeah, C tenant, exactly.
My wife does C, but I think she really means like L.
Yeah, something like that.
For some reason, there are tenants that think that it should be 85 degrees in their property, and you go in those properties and you're like, what in the world? Right. And then you walk in and like the guy doesn't have a shirt on and he's sitting in his shorts, and you're thinking to yourself, like, you're complaining that it's not hot enough in here.
Right.
Okay, but sorry,
we
are getting off on a different tangent.
Illustration.
All that to say, illustration of a C tenant.
So hopefully all this brought you value. We appreciate you joining us on this. And so we do sell turnkey rental properties. So if you're interested in building a portfolio, that's what we do. We build rental portfolios for investors. So you can reach out to me at jared@buyolsongroup.com, or you can go to our website at buyolsongroup.com and get on our list. And like Tom mentioned before, if you want to come and visit our operation, you can do so. I take and clear my schedules on Fridays. So Friday is the day you would come in. I would host you personally, take you to the market, show you the properties, and we can go about doing that. And so, Tom, do you have anything else you want to add?
That's it.
Awesome.
Everybody have a great day. It's snowing here in Northwest Indiana. We're having a great time.
Love it.
In February. And I can't wait to have a second home in Florida.
There you go.
For February.
It's great stuff. Active Turnkey Podcast.
The best way to buy rentals.
See you guys.
Olson Group Network makes no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast should not be considered professional advice. Unless specifically stated otherwise, Olson Group Network does not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement. Any third-party materials or content of any third-party site referenced in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions, standards, or policies of Olson Group Network. Olson Group Network assumes no responsibility or liability for the accuracy or completeness of the content contained in third-party materials or on third-party sites referenced in this podcast, or the compliance with the applicable laws of such materials and/or links referenced herein.